There's a particular kind of anxiety that comes from watching prices climb while your paycheck stays the same. A helpless feeling, like you're running on a treadmill that keeps getting faster while you're already at your limit. The winter of 1979 into 1980 brought that feeling to our small Massachusetts town in ways we'd never experienced before, and it taught me lessons about resilience and community that I carry with me to this day. My name is Paul, and this is the story of how inflation, gas lines, and economic chaos tested everything we thought we knew about making ends meet. I was 24 years old in the fall of 1979, married to Jessica for just over a year, and running my cafe on Main Street. We'd felt so optimistic when we'd gotten married in '78, young, in love, with a small business that was doing well enough to support us modestly. We lived in the apartment above the cafe, kept our expenses low, and managed to save a little each month. Life wasn't lavish, but it was good, stable, predictable, and then everything started falling apart. It began subtly, the way economic crises often do. In September, I noticed my food supplier had raised prices. Not dramatically, 5 cents more for a dozen eggs, 10 cents more for a pound of coffee, but enough to notice. I adjusted my own prices slightly to compensate, raising breakfast by a quarter, coffee by a nickel. Customers grumbled but paid it. By October, prices had gone up again, and again in November. Each time my supplier delivered, the invoice was higher than the last. Eggs that had cost 90 cents a dozen in August were $1.20 by Thanksgiving. Coffee had gone from $2 a pound to $2.75. Butter, flour, sugar, bacon, everything climbing steadily upward like a thermometer on a hot day. I tried to keep my menu prices stable, absorbing the increases as long as I could. But by December, I couldn't anymore. The math just didn't work. I was paying more for ingredients than I was charging for meals. Every plate I served was costing me money. So I raised prices again. Breakfast went from $1.75 to $2.25. A cup of coffee went from 35 cents to 50 cents. A slice of pie from 60 cents to 85 cents. The customers noticed immediately. Frank Morrison, who'd been coming in every morning for years, looked at the new menu and shook his head. 50 cents for coffee. He remembered when it was a dime. Hell, he remembered when it was a nickel. I explained the situation. My costs had doubled in 6 months. I couldn't operate at a loss. He understood, everyone understood, but understanding didn't make it easier to pay. People were dealing with the same thing everywhere. Everything was getting more expensive, but paychecks weren't keeping up. Then came the gas crisis. I remember the exact moment I realized how bad it was going to be. It was a Sunday morning in late December, and I'd driven out to the grocery store to pick up some supplies the cafe needed. As I pulled onto Main Street, I saw something that stopped me cold. A line of cars stretching from the Gulf Station on the corner all the way down 2 blocks, wrapped around onto Elm Street. At first, I thought there'd been an accident. But as I got closer, I realized what I was seeing. Every single one of those cars was waiting for gas. The oil crisis had been building for months, something to do with the Iranian Revolution, OPEC production cuts, political tensions I didn't fully understand. All I knew was that suddenly, there wasn't enough gasoline to go around. Stations were getting limited deliveries, running out by midday, leaving customers stranded. Prices were climbing daily. Gas that had been 65 cents a gallon in the summer was approaching $1 by winter. The lines became a daily reality. You couldn't just stop at a station when you needed gas anymore. You had to plan it, allow extra time, sometimes wait an hour or more just to fill your tank. Stations implemented odd-even rationing. If your license plate ended in an odd number, you could only buy gas on odd-numbered days. Even numbers on even days. People started obsessing over their gas gauges the way they'd previously obsessed over the weather. Conversations in the cafe shifted from sports and local gossip to mileage and fuel efficiency. Everyone had tips to share. Coast downhill to save gas. Don't use the air conditioning. Keep your tires properly inflated. The guy who'd bought a fuel-efficient Honda Civic was suddenly a genius instead of unpatriotic for not buying American. By January 1980, the economic situation had progressed from concerning to genuinely frightening. The news was full of terms I'd learned about in high school but never thought I'd experience. Stagflation, they called it. High inflation combined with high unemployment and slow economic growth. The worst of all possible worlds. Interest rates were climbing toward 20%. 20%. My parents had bought their house in the 50s with a mortgage at 4%. Now people couldn't afford to buy houses at all because the monthly payments at 20% interest were astronomical. Layoffs started hitting our town. The textile mill that had employed a quarter of the town's workforce for generations announced they were cutting 200 jobs. The furniture factory laid off 50 workers. Smaller businesses closed. Couldn't afford the rising costs of rent, supplies, utilities, everything. Every morning, the cafe filled with worried faces. Men who'd lost their jobs nursing a single cup of coffee for hours because it was warm and it gave them somewhere to be. Families stretching their dollars, ordering one meal to share between 3 people. People I'd known for years suddenly looking older, more tired, carrying a weight that showed in their shoulders and faces. Tommy Chan came in one February morning looking like he hadn't slept. The hardware store was struggling, he said. Sales were down 40%. People weren't buying anything they didn't absolutely need. He'd had to let go 2 of his 3 employees, was barely paying himself, was considering taking out a loan just to keep the doors open. But loans were almost impossible to get, and if you could get one, the interest rates would kill you. Tommy was trapped between closing the store his father had built or drowning in debt trying to save it. Jessica's situation was slightly better. She had a teaching job, and public school positions were relatively secure, but they'd frozen hiring and cut the budget for supplies. She was buying crayons and construction paper with her own money because the school couldn't afford them, and even her stable job had seen its purchasing power eroded. The salary that had seemed adequate in 1978 bought less and less each month as inflation ate away at it. The cafe was hanging on, but barely. I'd had to make impossible choices. My part-time helper, Sarah, had been with me for 3 years. She was a single mother, needed the income desperately, but I couldn't afford to keep paying her when business was slow. I let her go in March with a month's severance and a letter of recommendation, and I felt like I was betraying her even though I literally had no choice. The math didn't work. I couldn't pay her and keep the cafe open. I started working 16-hour days, 7 days a week, opening at 5 a.m. to catch the early breakfast crowd, mostly the guys who still had jobs and needed coffee before work. Staying open until 9 p.m. because every dinner customer mattered. Jessica helped when she could, coming in after school to wait tables, wash dishes, whatever needed doing. We were exhausted, constantly, profoundly exhausted. But we were also scared. Scared of joining the growing list of businesses that had closed. Scared of losing the cafe we'd worked so hard to build. Scared of not being able to pay rent, buy food, keep the electricity on. The community rallied in ways that still move me to remember. Frank Morrison organized what he called the Main Street Survival Pact. All the downtown business owners agreed to support each other whenever possible. We bought our supplies from each other instead of from cheaper suppliers outside town. We sent customers to each other. We shared information about dealing with suppliers, managing cash flow, cutting costs. Martha and Harold Henderson, both retired on fixed incomes that inflation was destroying, started a community garden in their backyard. They invited neighbors to take plots, grow vegetables, share the harvest. It wasn't charity. They framed it as everyone contributing labor and sharing the results. By summer, 24 families were growing food in that garden, supplementing their grocery bills with tomatoes and lettuce and beans they'd grown themselves. The church started a food pantry and a job board. People who needed work could post their skills. People who needed help could post jobs. It was informal, unofficial, often paid in cash or trade rather than checks. But it kept people afloat. My cafe became an unofficial community center during this time. I started something I called the Pay What You Can breakfast on Saturday mornings. Basic meal, eggs, toast, coffee, and you paid what you could afford. If you had $2, you paid $2. If you only had 50 cents, you paid 50 cents. If you had nothing, you ate anyway and paid me back when you could, or didn't, and that was fine too. I couldn't really afford to do this. My margins were already razor thin. But I also couldn't watch my neighbors go hungry when I had food and the ability to cook it. We'd all been hit by forces beyond our control. Government policies and international oil markets and economic forces that felt as arbitrary and unstable as weather. The only thing we could control was how we treated each other. Some weeks, the pay what you can breakfast barely covered the cost of ingredients. Other weeks, people who had a little extra would overpay, leaving $5 for a $2 meal, trying to balance out those who had nothing. It wasn't efficient or economically rational, but it was human. It was what communities did. By summer, we'd adapted to the new reality. We'd learned to live with less, to be creative, to help each other. The gas lines had eased slightly, though prices never went back down to where they'd been. The worst of the inflation seemed to be plateauing, though everything still cost dramatically more than it had a year earlier. Tommy kept his hardware store open by diversifying, adding a small rental department, offering repair services, finding used tools to sell alongside new ones. Sarah found a job at the textile mill. Ironically, she was hired to replace one of the people they'd laid off who'd found work elsewhere. Frank Morrison started a side business doing small engine repair out of his garage, supplementing his gas station income. Everyone adjusted, found ways to make it work, patched together solutions from whatever materials were at hand. But the experience left scars. We'd seen how quickly stability could disappear, how vulnerable we all were to forces beyond our control. People who'd lived comfortably their whole lives had suddenly been unable to afford groceries. People who'd worked hard and saved responsibly had watched inflation eat away their savings. The social contract, the idea that if you worked hard and played by the rules, you'd be okay, had been revealed as more fragile than we'd believed. The economy eventually recovered, more or less. Inflation came down in the early 80s, though it took years. Interest rates eventually dropped. Jobs slowly came back. Life returned to something approximating normal, though normal had been permanently redefined. Prices never went back down to where they'd been. Gas would never again be 60 cents a gallon. Coffee would never again be 35 cents a cup. And more than prices had changed. Something psychological had shifted. The optimism of the 60s and early 70s, the belief that every generation would do better than the last, that progress was inevitable and upward, had been replaced with something more cautious. People saved more, spent less, worried about the future in ways they hadn't before. I'm 73 now, and I've lived through several economic crises since 1979 to 80. Each one has its own character, its own causes, its own victims. But that first one, when I was 24 and terrified of losing everything Jessica and I had built, taught me lessons I've never forgotten. I learned that economic security is more fragile than it appears. That stability can vanish overnight through no fault of your own. That the difference between getting by and going under can be measured in pennies. But I also learned about resilience, about communities that come together instead of falling apart, about people who help each other not because they expect something in return, but because it's the right thing to do, about creativity and adaptation and the human capacity to keep going even when everything seems impossible. The younger generation today, they face their own economic challenges. Student loans that previous generations didn't have. Housing costs that have far outpaced wages. A job market that demands more flexibility and offers less security. They're living through their own version of what we experienced in 1979 to 80, and I see the same worry, the same exhaustion, the same fear. But I also see the same resilience, the same creativity, the same capacity to adapt and support each other and keep going despite everything. Because here's what I learned during those dark months of 1979 and 1980, what I've held on to through every crisis since. Economic systems are impersonal and often cruel. But communities are made of people, and people can choose to be kind. We can choose to help instead of exploit. We can choose to share instead of hoard. We can choose to see each other's struggles and respond with compassion instead of judgment. The pay-what-you-can breakfast I started in 1980 became a permanent fixture at the cafe. 43 years later, we still do it every Saturday morning. Most weeks now, it operates at a profit. The overpayment from those who have extra more than covers the underpayment from those who don't. But every few years, during economic downturns, the balance shifts. More people paying less, fewer people paying extra. And I keep doing it anyway, because I remember what it felt like to be 24 and terrified, trying to keep a business alive with determination and hope and not much else. I remember Frank Morrison, who kept coming in for coffee every morning even when I knew he couldn't really afford it, because the cafe was his anchor, his routine, his community. I remember Tommy Chen, who refused to close his father's hardware store even when every rational calculation said he should, because some things matter more than profit and loss. I remember Martha Henderson, turning her backyard into a garden and sharing the harvest, because feeding people mattered more than property lines. I remember that winter and spring of economic crisis not as a time when everything fell apart, but as a time when we discovered what really held us together. Not money or markets or economic systems, but each other. Our willingness to help, to share, to sacrifice, to care. That's what got us through 1979 to 80. That's what gets us through every crisis. Not economic policy or market forces, but human decency and community solidarity. And that's a lesson worth remembering, no matter what challenges we face.